Avoidants rarely grasp the real damage they've caused until the silence they created comes back to face them. During a relationship, they often move through it with the quiet assumption that you'll always stay available, always forgive them, always give them another chance. They mistake your patience for permanence and your loyalty for something that could never fade. In their mind, your love feels sturdy enough to survive anything. That's where their biggest mistake starts. Most avoidants aren't trying to wound someone out of cruelty. They create distance because they believe they can always dodge emotional discomfort without paying a lasting price. Instead of considering how deeply their actions affect another person, they focus on finding a way out of overwhelming feelings. When they withdraw, shut down, or make choices that hurt you, their attention is fixed on escaping intensity rather than grasping its impact. What they miss is that every escape slowly erodes the very connection they secretly rely on. They live with the constant belief that emotional closeness is risky, yet the thought of permanently losing someone who genuinely loved them becomes crushing once it's too late. That inner contradiction quietly becomes the reason everything eventually collapses. For a long time, they believed you'd always be the one to break the silence first. They expected you to bridge every emotional gap, overlook every withdrawal, and keep carrying the relationship whenever things got hard. Your consistency convinced them they could create distance without paying for it. Then something happened they never truly saw coming. You went quiet. You stepped away, not to manipulate them or teach them a lesson, but because you finally chose to protect your own peace. That decision changed everything. The silence they once counted on suddenly carried weight they couldn't ignore. The distance they assumed was temporary became something real. The person they believed would never leave finally stopped reaching back. While avoidants often know how to live with the constant noise in their own heads, your absence felt completely different. It wasn't a game or an emotional test. It was a clear boundary, and boundaries expose truths they've spent years dodging. For the first time, they were forced to confront the reality that not everyone waits forever. Not everyone tolerates inconsistency, and not every loyal person keeps investing in someone who repeatedly causes them pain. When your voice faded from their life and your energy was no longer there to reassure them, they didn't feel free. Instead, they felt the collapse of a connection they never learned how to protect. Their betrayal did more than push you away. It exposed how fragile their emotional foundation had always been. In trying to dodge commitment and vulnerability, they ended up losing the very person who brought stability into their life. What looked like a temporary decision became a reflection they could no longer avoid, forcing them to admit the problem had never truly been you. It was the pattern they kept repeating. By the time they finally understood that, your silence had already rewritten the ending, leaving behind a reality where the comforting illusion they leaned on no longer existed. One of the biggest mistakes avoidants make is assuming your love has no limits. Much of their emotional world rests on assumptions rather than honest awareness, and one assumption towers over the rest. They believe you'll never truly leave. They lean on your reliability without fully noticing how much comfort it gives them, much like someone depends on a familiar light in the dark without ever registering it's there. Time after time, they watched you stay present despite their emotional distance, confusing behavior, or inability to communicate openly. You stayed through stretches of withdrawal, emotional shutdowns, and moments when they seemed completely unreachable. Instead of seeing your commitment as something valuable, they slowly started treating it as ordinary. Your loyalty became expected instead of appreciated. Most avoidants aren't consciously testing the people they love. Their behavior comes from old protective habits formed long before meeting you. Pulling away, sending mixed signals, hiding behind emotional walls became automatic responses to vulnerability. Because you met those responses with patience instead of rejection, they assumed you always would. That belief made betrayal feel less dangerous than it really was. They never imagined their choices could actually cost them the relationship. In their mind, your love worked like a safety net that would always be there no matter how far they pulled away. So when they crossed emotional lines by withholding honesty, creating distance, pushing you aside, or investing elsewhere emotionally, they treated those moves as temporary escapes rather than irreversible damage. To them, stepping away felt safer than facing emotional exposure because they believed they could always return to where they'd left off. Your devotion became the most predictable part of their life, and they confused that predictability with permanence. What they failed to grasp was that loving someone deeply is still a choice, not an obligation. Unconditional love doesn't mean unlimited tolerance. The moment they repeatedly betrayed that choice, the foundation under the relationship quietly started to shift. Everything changed the moment you stopped carrying the emotional weight alone. When you stopped chasing conversations, stopped over-explaining yourself, and stopped trying to patch every emotional disconnect, the system they'd relied on suddenly broke down. They were completely unprepared because they expected closeness to feel overwhelming, not separation. They expected emotional intensity to suffocate them, not your silence to leave such a hollow space. Yet your absence created a loneliness they'd never learned to manage. The person they believed would always be available was suddenly gone, and the realization hit harder than expected. Perhaps for the first time, they had to accept a truth they'd spent years dodging. Love is never guaranteed just because it existed yesterday. Loyalty has limits when someone keeps getting hurt without any change. Even the most patient heart eventually reaches a point where self-protection becomes necessary. The person they were sure would always stay became the one who taught them the hardest lesson of all, that taking genuine love for granted is often the quickest way to lose it. By assuming your devotion could survive anything, they unknowingly built the exact circumstances that led you to walk away. Only then did they realize that losing you wasn't random or unavoidable. It was the natural outcome of patterns they never believed would have consequences. Avoidants often don't fully miss someone the moment they leave. The deepest realization comes later, once they understand you're not coming back. That's the moment their certainty crumbles, their emotional defenses start to crack, and the reality of what they lost finally sinks in. At first, when you stop reaching out, many avoidants feel something close to relief, not because they're happier without you, but because the emotional intensity they've been trying to escape suddenly lifts. Their nervous system settles, and the quiet feels soothing for a while. Since closeness often feels overwhelming to them, your absence can feel like a chance to breathe again. They reassure themselves they simply needed more room, that things had gotten too emotionally demanding, and that stepping back was the healthiest move. They see the distance as temporary rather than permanent, assuming you'll eventually return, just as you always have. But when the silence stretches on, everything starts to shift. The messages they expected never come. Your familiar presence stays gone, and the emotional energy they once counted on is nowhere to be found. That's when uncertainty starts replacing relief. Suddenly, your silence carries more weight than your constant presence ever did. Confusion slowly turns into restlessness, and restlessness turns into emotional instability. This is the stage they never prepared for, because they never imagined losing someone who'd been consistently there. At first, they can't understand why you've stopped trying. They wonder why you haven't reached out, why you haven't broken the silence, and why you seem content to let the distance sit. Because they believed your patience had no limits, your absence feels unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. As time goes by, they can no longer dodge what's happening inside them. Without you unconsciously balancing the relationship, they're left alone with emotions they've spent years pushing aside. The anxiety they once escaped by creating distance no longer has anywhere to go. Instead of fading, it grows louder, forcing them to face feelings they'd hoped would stay buried. Eventually, another realization starts forming, one they can't distract themselves from. They discover that what you brought into their life can't simply be swapped out. They may throw themselves into work, hobbies, new routines, or even new relationships, hoping something else fills the space you left. Yet every attempt feels incomplete. No conversation carries the same depth, no connection offers the same comfort, and nothing recreates the quiet emotional safety they unknowingly relied on. That's when they start replaying the past. They revisit old conversations, remember your patience, your consistency, the small moments they once brushed past. It isn't simple nostalgia. They're searching for the point where everything unraveled. Looking back, they finally notice the worth of the things they dismissed while they still had them. This is when they truly begin to miss you, not simply because you're gone, but because they finally recognize everything your presence quietly gave them. You offered stability during uncertain moments, warmth when they withdrew, and reassurance without demanding perfection in return. Most avoidants believe they're chasing freedom or peace, yet they fail to see that you had become one of the few real sources of peace in their life. Your silence becomes an unavoidable mirror of every decision they made, every wall they built, and every chance for closeness they turned down. The deepest pain isn't only realizing they miss you, it's recognizing that they pushed away someone whose intentions were always rooted in care. They often don't fully feel the loss when the relationship ends. They feel it only once they understand you're not coming back. That realization turns temporary silence into permanent absence, and with it comes a loneliness they never expected. In chasing emotional freedom, they unknowingly built the emptiness they'd hoped to escape. When they chose to leave, betray your trust, dismiss your feelings, or repeatedly create distance, they genuinely believed they were choosing something that would make life easier. They convinced themselves they were protecting their independence, regaining control, or giving themselves the room they thought they desperately needed. From where they stood, pulling away promised clarity and relief. What they failed to see was that what looked like freedom was often avoidance dressed up as self-protection. Every time they dodged vulnerability instead of facing it, they postponed a reckoning that would eventually catch up with them. To justify their actions, they built stories that made the distance seem reasonable. They convinced themselves you were too emotionally invested, too demanding, or simply too much to handle. They repeated the idea that they weren't ready, that they only needed room to breathe, and that life would be simpler without the expectations of a close relationship. For a while, those explanations felt convincing enough to quiet their discomfort. That's why losing you didn't scare them right away. It followed a familiar pattern they'd leaned on for years whenever intimacy got uncomfortable. But over time, cracks start showing in those explanations. They notice that the people they turn to for distraction never offer the same emotional depth. Conversations stay surface level, affection feels inconsistent, and the quiet sense of security they once had with you is missing. Most avoidants find it extremely hard to openly show regret. They hesitate to apologize, put off reaching out, and steer clear of emotionally exposing conversations. Yet inside, the emotional spiral keeps going. Your absence becomes an unavoidable reminder of every decision they made. Each passing day deepens the realization that they walked away from someone who accepted their imperfections, respected their boundaries, and stayed patient despite their fears. No distraction is strong enough to quiet that awareness forever. Eventually, they understand you were never just another relationship. You had become a source of emotional balance they couldn't rebuild anywhere else. Losing you was never just about losing a partner. It meant losing understanding, consistency, acceptance, and a connection far rarer than they ever realized. In trying so hard to dodge attachment, they ultimately discover the painful truth that the person who truly mattered can't simply be swapped out. Their greatest heartbreak isn't only that you left, it's realizing they were the one who let go of someone irreplaceable. Avoidants often spend years believing that emotional distance equals safety, that independence guarantees freedom, and that dodging vulnerability protects them from pain. Losing someone who genuinely cared for them slowly takes those beliefs apart one by one. The realization rarely lands dramatically. Instead, it shows up during ordinary moments, when they suddenly notice you're no longer part of their daily life. At first, they keep telling themselves everything will eventually settle back to normal. They assume time will close the gap, or that another distraction will eventually take your place, yet nothing truly replaces what was lost. Gradually, they start noticing all the things they once treated as ordinary. Your patience, your steady support, your knack for making hard moments feel lighter, and the emotional stability your presence quietly created. Every memory reminds them of what they failed to value while they still had it. Unlike before, there's no dodging accountability, because your absence leaves nowhere to hide. They're finally forced to look inward, instead of focusing only on the relationship. That reflection exposes every fear, every emotional defense, and every unhealthy pattern that shaped their choices. The silence you left behind becomes a teacher they never expected. Your absence mirrors everything they spent years avoiding. Slowly, they understand they didn't simply lose a relationship. They lost someone who brought peace into their emotional chaos. Someone who stood beside them through moments when many others would have walked away. The hardest part is recognizing this outcome wasn't caused by fate, but by the walls they refused to lower. Although they may never voice these realizations dramatically, they keep living with them internally. Every memory, every quiet evening, every attempt to move forward reminds them of the person they underestimated. Eventually, they reach a truth they can no longer deny. Losing you didn't expose your weakness. It exposed their own unresolved fears, emotional defenses, and patterns of self-sabotage. They finally recognized that the greatest damage was never the relationship ending. It was realizing they undervalued someone whose presence quietly held their emotional world together until it was gone.